There are people who learn far too early that their needs come second to everyone else's comfort. They grow up whispering instead of speaking, moving carefully so no one feels disturbed, and thanking others for even the smallest kindness, as if they are asking for something extraordinary. They carry a quiet belief that their presence takes up too much space, costs too much energy, asks for more than it should. And yet, behind this gentleness is a history no one sees. A childhood where the air felt fragile. A home where someone was always tired, stressed, or hurting. A world where one wrong moment could make love feel conditional. So they learned to shrink, to help, to stay out of the way. Even as adults, the belief follows them like a soft shadow. If I ask for too much, they might leave. This script is about that shadow and the heart beneath it. There is a particular kind of quiet carried by people who grew up feeling like a burden. It isn't the quiet of peace or contentment. It is the quiet of self-protection. The quiet that forms when speaking feels dangerous, when needs feel heavy, and when emotions feel like they might inconvenience someone who never had room for them. This quiet doesn't shout. It barely moves. It sits in the chest like a small folded animal, waiting for the world to be safe before it breathes fully. When these individuals enter a room, their first instinct is to read it rather than belong to it. They scan expressions, measure tones, pick up on the slightest shift in mood, not because they want control, but because they once believed that if they could just stay out of the way, everything would hurt a little less. Their childhood trained them to sense tension before it arrived. Their body learned to soften their footsteps, to lower their voice, to make themselves easy to tolerate. And even now, as adults, the habit remains. There is something heartbreaking about this instinct. The way they apologize for things they never did. The way they speak quietly even when no one is upset. The way they brace themselves when asking a simple question. They do not realize how often they say, "sorry." They do not notice how their shoulders curve inward during conversations, how their breathing turns shallow when someone looks at them too long, how they try to make every part of themselves take up a little less space. This is not shyness. It is not humility. It is survival. For them, needing less became a way to be loved, or at least a way not to be rejected. And so they constructed emotional patterns around being easy. The easy child, the easy friend, the easy partner, the one who doesn't argue, the one who understands, the one who adjusts, the one who carries inconvenience silently so no one else has to. But beneath the surface, there is a quiet ache, a sensation that something essential has been suppressed for years, a longing to be held without fear, a desire to express something without rehearsing it first, a wish to exist without calculating every emotional cost. This ache often shows up in small, unspoken moments, when they hesitate before sharing good news, afraid it might sound like bragging, when they swallow sadness because expressing it feels like adding weight to someone else's shoulders, when they rehearse messages before sending them, trying to ensure the wording doesn't bother anyone, when they offer help even when they are exhausted, believing that being useful is the only way to earn closeness. It is in these moments that their childhood belief, the belief that they were too much, quietly resurfaces. But perhaps the most painful part is this. People who grew up feeling like a burden often don't realize this belief lives inside them. They just think they are being considerate. They think they are low maintenance. They think they are protecting others. They don't see how their self-erasure has become instinctive, automatic, invisible even to themselves. And yet, their body remembers. Their nervous system remembers. Their heart remembers. It remembers the times they needed comfort but stayed silent. The times they felt fear but smiled anyway. The times they wanted to be held but stepped back instead. The times they learned that love demands smallness. This chapter is about that memory, the emotional landscape of someone who has lived most of their life trying not to take up space. The tender, often unnoticed grief of a person who never learned that their presence could be welcomed without condition. And as gentle as they appear on the outside, there is a storm inside them, quiet, controlled, but powerful. A storm made of years of swallowed words, unmet needs, and love that felt safer when it was unspoken. This is the silent feeling that begins their story, a feeling that shapes everything until they finally learn to look at it, and eventually to question whether it was ever theirs to carry. A child never decides on their own that they are a burden. That belief is planted quietly, almost accidentally, in the small spaces of early life, between a parent's sigh, a distracted response, a frustrated tone, or a moment where a need was met with exhaustion instead of warmth. Children do not understand context. They only understand impact. And the impact of those early moments settles deep inside them, forming the first outline of who they believe they are allowed to be. Most of the time, it begins in homes where the adults were overwhelmed, not necessarily unloving, but stretched thin by life. A parent who is grieving, a parent who is depressed, a parent who is working too much, a parent who feels unheard, a parent who never had space for their own needs, a parent who carries storms inside themselves. In these homes, a child learns early that emotions are delicate things and that asking for too much could tip the balance. Even well-meaning caregivers can send quiet messages of inconvenience. A tired, not now. A frustrated, why are you like this? A disappointed, you're making things difficult. Or even silence, the kind that feels heavy, unapproachable, distant. To an adult, these moments might seem forgettable. To a child, they become a map of how to behave. If a parent becomes irritated when the child cries, the child learns to hold their tears. If a parent becomes stressed when the child asks questions, the child learns to stay quiet. If a parent becomes overwhelmed by life, the child learns to shrink so they don't add to the weight already filling the room. The child begins to watch everyone's mood. They start to feel responsible for peace. They start to believe that their needs create pressure. In some families, the burden feeling is born from comparison. A sibling who needs more attention because of illness, behavior, or circumstance leaves the child believing that their own needs are less important. They become the easy one, the one who doesn't cause problems, the one who adapts to whatever is happening around them. Their identity forms around not wanting to add even one more drop to a house already full of emotional water. In other homes, the burden feeling comes from unpredictability. A parent's anger arrives without warning. A parent's affection appears conditionally. A parent's emotional availability shifts depending on stresses the child cannot see. The child doesn't understand inconsistency. They only understand cause and effect. And so, they start to assume that if something goes wrong, it must have come from them. There are even gentler versions of this wound, the ones that come from subtle misattunement. A parent who loves deeply but doesn't emotionally see the child. A parent who provides everything except presence. A parent who is physically there but emotionally far away. And to a child who longs to be felt, not just cared for, emotional distance feels like rejection. So they blame themselves. They decide something inside them is inconvenient, excessive, or simply unwanted in its full form. By the time this child becomes a teenager, the story is already written. They apologize before entering a room. They fear being too emotional, too sensitive, too much. They learn to solve problems alone. They hide their pain so others won't feel troubled. They begin to offer help as a way to earn closeness. They mask discomfort with a smile. and they learn to expect very little in return. These patterns don't announce themselves loudly. They grow quietly, silently, steadily, and eventually they shape an adult who is convinced that asking for support is selfish, that needing reassurance is weakness, and that love must always be earned by being small, predictable, and easy. But beneath these patterns, the origins remain. A child who never wanted to be a burden, who only wanted the world to feel safe, and who learned to protect others long before they were old enough to protect themselves. This is where the story begins, not with fault, but with misunderstanding, not with lack of love, but lack of emotional space, not with a flawed child, but with a home that couldn't hold their full weight, and the child, trying to keep the peace, learned to carry their own. The belief of being a burden doesn't stay in the mind. It settles into the nervous system, quietly shaping how a person feels, reacts, and connects long before they understand what psychology is. A child who grows up tiptoeing around emotional tension develops certain patterns not out of choice, but out of survival. These patterns become their language, their instincts, their way of moving through the world. The first pattern is hypervigilance, a constant scanning of faces, tones, and atmospheres. Long before they learn words like attachment or regulation, their body already calculates danger. A sigh, a shift in posture, a change in silence, these become warnings. The child pays attention, not because they want to, but because the cost of missing something once felt too high. Their nervous system becomes alert, anticipating rejection, irritation, or disappointment. And as they grow older, this hyper-awareness blends into their personality. They're called observant, thoughtful, easygoing, without anyone realizing that these traits were born from fear, not freedom. The second pattern is the fawn response, a lesser-known survival instinct where the child becomes overly accommodating to avoid conflict. While some children fight or flee, these children learn to soothe, to please, to fix, to stabilize the emotional environment. Their identity forms around being agreeable, because being agreeable once felt like safety. As adults, this becomes the tendency to avoid saying no, to overextend for others, and to believe their worth exists in their usefulness. Then comes emotional minimization. A child who feels like a burden learns early that their emotions are too much, so they swallow them. They learn to cry quietly or not at all. They learn to hide disappointment because showing it invites discomfort. They learn to regulate themselves without guidance, not because they want independence, but because expressing pain once made things worse. This emotional self-sufficiency looks admirable from the outside, but internally, it creates emptiness, a deep uncertainty about whether anyone would care if they did speak, if they did need, if they did break down. Psychologists call this insecure attachment, specifically patterns leaning toward anxious preoccupied or anxious avoidant styles. In simple terms, it means the person both longs for closeness and fears that their closeness will drive others away. Their relationships become a tug of war between reaching out and pulling back. They want to be understood, yet they silence themselves. They want comfort, yet they hide their sadness. They crave reassurance, yet they apologize for needing it. This psychological pattern also reshapes their internal monologue. They begin to overthink before speaking. They rehearse texts before sending them. They analyze whether they're too much, too emotional, too sensitive. They believe love must be earned, not simply received. Over time, another layer forms, self-blame. Because the child assumes responsibility for adult emotions, they grow into adults who feel responsible for everything. If someone is upset, they assume they caused it. If someone pulls away, they assume they pushed too hard. Even in moments where they are clearly mistreated, their first thought is, "What did I do wrong?" Ironically, this makes them compassionate to a fault. They understand pain too deeply, they forgive too quickly, they empathize even when they are the ones hurting, because their brain learned long ago that harmony is more important than honesty. But beneath all of this, beneath the hypervigilance, the fawning, the emotional minimization, the self-blame, is a simple, fragile truth. They never learned that their needs were human. They never learned that their voice mattered. They never learned that love could be steady, safe, and unconditional. And so, the burden story stays with them into adulthood, not as a conscious belief, but as a psychological imprint, a set of patterns the body follows even when the mind tries to unlearn them. This chapter is not about fault. It is about understanding. Understanding why someone who appears so calm, so gentle, so accommodating might actually be carrying a lifetime of silent fear. Fear of the very thing every child and every adult deserves most: to take up space without apology. By the time someone reaches adulthood with the belief that they are a burden, the outside world sees a person who is calm, helpful, and reliable. But inside, there is a war that almost no one notices. A quiet conflict between longing and fear, closeness and distance, expression and silence. It is a war that plays out in the smallest moments, in things they do without even understanding why. The first battleground is connection. They want intimacy. They want to be seen, understood, chosen without hesitation. But the moment someone gets close, something inside them tightens. A fear rises, not of the other person, but of their own weight. What if I'm too much? What if I ask for too much? What if needing something ruins everything? So they pull back, even when their heart wants to move forward. They limit their own vulnerability to avoid risking the disappointment they once felt as children. They love deeply, but they reveal themselves slowly. They trust softly. They show affection carefully, as though they're afraid of overstaying their welcome. The second battleground is receiving. They have no difficulty giving. They can give time, empathy, reassurance, emotional labor endlessly, almost effortlessly. But receiving, that is where the storm begins. A compliment makes them uncomfortable. A favor feels like debt. Support feels like they're imposing. They say, "It's okay, don't worry, I can handle it," even when they are exhausted, because receiving means acknowledging their own needs, and needs still feel heavy. The third battleground is emotion. Anytime they feel disappointment, sadness, anger, or confusion, an inner voice quickly whispers, "Keep it to yourself. Don't make things harder for anyone." So they swallow their frustration. They smile through discomfort. They stay gentle even when they are hurt. This self-silencing becomes so practiced that they eventually lose touch with what they feel. Not because the feelings disappear, but because expressing them once felt unsafe. Emotion, for them, is not a conversation. It's a private burden. The fourth battleground is self-worth. People who grew up feeling like a burden don't see themselves clearly. They often believe others tolerate them rather than genuinely value them. They feel replaceable, forgettable, easy to let go of. So they pour effort into relationships, checking in constantly, overthinking messages, worrying about being misunderstood. They try to be the perfect friend, perfect partner, perfect listener. They try so hard to be helpful that they forget how to simply be themselves. And then comes resentment, a quiet emotion they almost never express. Not resentment toward others, but resentment toward themselves, for not speaking up, for always being the strong one, for always staying quiet, for giving so much and receiving so little. They blame themselves for the imbalance they never learned to question. Inside them, there is a strange contradiction. They want someone to choose them without needing to perform, but they don't believe they deserve to be chosen unless they do. It is a painful loop. Longing, fear, silence, loneliness, longing again. A cycle of wanting connection while actively avoiding anything that might create it. This inner war is invisible to most people. On the outside, they look calm. On the inside, they are constantly negotiating between two parts of themselves, the part that wants to be held and the part that wants to disappear. But the heart can only live in conflict for so long. Eventually, something small begins to shift. A moment arrives, often quietly, when they realize that their exhaustion is not from the world, but from the emotional labor they carry inside themselves. A whisper emerges, not loud but undeniable. Maybe this story isn't the only one available to me. And that whisper becomes the beginning of change. The first crack in the belief that they are a burden. The first opening for something gentler to enter. Real change rarely begins with a dramatic moment. For people who grew up feeling like a burden, the shift usually starts in silence. A small pause, a faint discomfort, a brief awareness that something inside them no longer wants to remain hidden. It is not a breakthrough. It is a tremor, a soft cracking in a story that has been held too tightly for too long. It often begins with exhaustion, a type of tiredness that rest doesn't fix, a heaviness that comes from years of overgiving, over-adjusting, and overthinking. They start to notice how drained they feel after conversations where they carry the emotional weight for two people. They feel the ache of always being the listener, the helper, the one who smooths the edges of every interaction. They notice that everyone leans on them, but they lean on no one. The second crack appears in confusion, a moment where they suddenly ask themselves, "Why am I apologizing? What did I do wrong?" The apology slips out automatically, but the question lingers. For the first time, they sense that the guilt they carry may not actually belong to them. Then comes an unexpected moment of discomfort in relationships they once felt grateful for. A friend dismisses their feelings. A partner overlooks their needs. A colleague expects them to pick up the slack. These are things they once accepted as normal, but now something inside protests, quietly, timidly, but undeniably. It's the first time they feel a whisper of self-worth, pushing against the old habit of shrinking. And then there's the subtle recognition of loneliness. Not the loneliness of being alone, but the loneliness of being unseen, even while surrounded by people. They realize that most of their connections are built on their ability to give, to soothe, to support, not on their ability to be vulnerable. There is a sudden longing for reciprocity, for emotional softness to flow both ways. This longing surprises them. It feels unfamiliar, almost rebellious, but it signals something essential. A part of them is waking up. Another crack appears in moments of unexpected tenderness, when someone actually shows care without being asked. A friend checks in first. Someone notices their sadness. Someone offers help gently. The moment is beautiful but unsettling. Their instinct is to refuse, to say, "I'm okay," even when they're not. But a small part of them aches to accept it. And that conflict, wanting to receive yet fearing it, reveals how deeply the old belief has shaped them. Sometimes the shift comes through observing others. They watch someone else express needs confidently, and no one is upset. They watch someone say no without guilt. They watch someone cry openly and still be loved. There is awe in seeing that world exist. A world where being human doesn't feel heavy. But the most powerful crack is simply awareness. A moment when they sit alone, often late at night, and think, "Why do I feel responsible for everyone's emotions? Why do I fear disappointing people so much? Why does needing someone scare me? Why do I love so, gently but never let myself be held?" These questions arrive softly. They don't demand change. They don't rush healing. They simply open a door. And once that door opens, even a little, the old story cannot remain untouched. The belief that they are a burden begins to loosen, not because someone convinces them otherwise, but because their own experience contradicts it. Their own fatigue contradicts it. Their own longing contradicts it. Their own quiet desire to exist without apology contradicts it. This chapter is the moment the story starts to tremble. The moment they look at the life they've built and realize that shrinking has not protected them. It has only kept them unknown. And beneath all their careful gentleness lies a truth they are finally ready to touch. It was never their presence that was too much. It was the spaces they grew up in that were too little. This realization doesn't heal them, but it is the first time they see the possibility of a life where they are allowed to exist in full. Healing, for someone who grew up feeling like a burden, is not a sudden transformation. It is not a loud awakening or a dramatic declaration of self-worth. It begins in the quietest places, places where they finally allow themselves to feel, to want, to rest without guilt. Healing is a slow permission slip they write for themselves, often reluctantly, sometimes fearfully, but always honestly. The first step is unlearning silence. Not the silence of peace, but the silence of self-erasure. For most of their life, they have swallowed their needs before they could become words. Their throat learned to close before their truth could escape. Healing begins when that instinct softens a little. When they say, "I'm actually not okay," even if their voice trembles. When they express a preference instead of saying, "Anything is fine." When they admit disappointment instead of pretending it didn't hurt. These small acts are not dramatic, but they are profoundly brave. They are the first signs of reclaiming space. The next step comes through emotional permission, allowing themselves to feel without judgment, sadness without apology, anger without shame, fear without dismissal. They begin to understand that emotions are not weights, they are signals, and that expressing them is not a burden, it is a right. Many of them discover, often with surprise, that the people who truly care about them don't resent their emotions. They don't flinch at tears. They don't recoil when needs are expressed. They don't interpret vulnerability as inconvenience. And in seeing this, the person begins to challenge the old story that emotions make them too much. Another part of healing is receiving, perhaps the hardest skill for them to learn. Letting someone help carry their bags. Letting someone ask how they are and answering truthfully. Letting someone show up for them without feeling indebted. Letting someone love them without believing they need to earn it. Receiving is frightening because it touches the very fear they grew up with. The fear that their presence creates stress. But slowly, through repeated experiences of gentle people, they begin to learn that receiving is not taking. Receiving is allowing connection to be mutual. It is participating in the emotional exchange they've always given to others. Then comes redefining responsibility. They begin to separate what belongs to them from what belongs to others. They start releasing the guilt that never belonged to them. The childhood belief that other people's moods were their fault. This is not about becoming selfish. It's about finally understanding the boundary between compassion and self-sacrifice. As they grow, something else shifts quietly. Their body starts to relax. The shoulders soften, the breath deepens, the chest loosens. The nervous system, once wired for hypervigilance, learns safety through repeated experiences of being treated with care. They begin to make choices from authenticity rather than fear. They say no when they mean it. They take up space in conversations. They let their laughter be loud, their needs be spoken, their presence be real. And something inside them, something fragile and long hidden, begins to bloom. A sense of self that is not defined by usefulness, but by humanity. a worthiness that is not earned, but inherent, a feeling that they are allowed to be here, not because they are perfect or helpful or quiet, but because they are a person. Healing is not linear. Some days they shrink again. Some days the old belief returns. Some days they feel guilty for taking up space. But now they notice it, they question it, they interrupt it. They begin to tell themselves new sentences. I'm not a burden. My needs matter. My emotions deserve space. I am allowed to receive love without fear. This chapter is the slow, gentle reclamation of existence, a journey back to their own body, their own voice, their own presence, a quiet unfolding into a life where they no longer apologize for being human. There comes a moment, often so gentle it's easy to miss, when a person who spent their entire life shrinking begins to live differently, not loudly, not defiantly, but with a softness that finally belongs to them, not borrowed from survival. It happens slowly, quiet shifts in posture, tone, presence, like a dawn arriving without asking permission. They begin to inhabit their own life in a way that once felt impossible. The first sign of this new life is easiness. Not the false ease they projected for years, the kind born from silence and self-denial, but a true ease, the kind that comes from finally knowing they do not have to perform to be loved. Their shoulders no longer curl inward. Their eyes meet others with calm instead of caution. Their sentences carry weight without apology. They begin to say things like, "Actually, I'd prefer this," or "That hurt me," or "I need support." And the world does not collapse. The room does not tighten. The people who love them do not disappear. This simple truth becomes transformative. They start experiencing connection in a new way, deeper, steadier, less fragile, because now it is built on honesty, not on hiding, on expression, not on erasure, on mutuality, not on emotional labor disguised as devotion. They begin to trust that their presence is not something others endure, it is something others welcome. As they grow into this new story, relationships shift. Some deepen beautifully, those rooted in reciprocity, empathy, and genuine understanding. Others fade quietly, the ones that survived, only because they stayed small. This is not loss. It is alignment. For the first time, they are choosing what nourishes them instead of what drains them. There is also a new relationship emerging, a relationship with their own emotions. Where they once swallowed sadness, they now hold it. Where they once feared anger, they now listen to it. Where they once ignored their needs, they now acknowledge them gently. The body becomes a home instead of a battlefield. Their heart becomes a companion instead of an inconvenience. And in these moments of emotional honesty, something beautiful happens. They begin to feel present in conversations instead of calculating their impact, present in relationships instead of anticipating rejection, present in their own life instead of living through the needs of others. This presence creates a quiet confidence, one that doesn't need validation or attention. It is the confidence of someone who knows their existence is not a burden but a truth, a life that deserves space, breath, softness, and care. The narrative they carried for years, "I am too much, I am too heavy, I am in the way," begins to dissolve. Not all at once, not forever, but piece by piece, softened by the reality of their experiences, softened by people who treat them gently, softened by the strength they discover in themselves. They start to see themselves differently, not as the quiet child who stayed out of the way, but as an adult who is learning to take their rightful place in the world. And then comes the most profound shift of all, the ability to belong without shrinking, to enter a room without scanning for danger, to speak without rehearsing, to exist without guilt. This freedom is not loud, it is peaceful, It is steady. It is earned through years of inner work they didn't even know they were doing. Eventually, they look back at their past self, the child who believed they were a burden, and feel something unexpected. Compassion. Not shame, not anger. Just a deep, tender understanding of how hard that child tried to feel safe, how much they carried, how unfair it was that they ever felt unwanted. And in that moment of compassion, the story completes its circle, not with triumph, but with truth. They were never a burden. They were a child doing their best in a world that did not yet know how to hold them. And now, finally, they are learning how to hold themselves.